What is up, everyone? My name is Henry from Northern Card Gaming, and today I have you a true Draco Paleozoic deck profile, a deck that I think that can survive, especially in this 2-week period that we have before Call of the Duelist drops out. I think that right now the best way to play around the true Draco Demise deck is to negate the cards that let them search for the masterpiece. And Totally Awesome is definitely one of those cards. Now, Paleozoic is probably the best deck to make Totally Awesome, so therefore I consider Paleozoics as a worthy archetype for this current meta. Now, with that being said, I believe that Masterpiece is probably the best monster to put on the field outside of the extra monster zone. And I also think that Dynamite Knight has tremendous synergy with the Frog Paleozoic deck, being that it is a water, and also because it searches traps. So, with that being said, let's get into the deck profile, and I can explain to you guys the synergy that the two archetypes have. To start off the deck profile, we have our monsters, and we only run one copy of Masterpiece, the True Draco Slaying King. I was actually considering not even running this card in the deck, but it does have tremendous potential to win games by itself. We run 2 copies of Dynamite Knight. Dynamite Knight is a water, so it can be pitched off of Swap Frog and recycled with Totally Awesome. And it searches traps, which trigger your Paleozoic part of the deck. And so, with that being said, it can also be revived by True King's Return. So, we do run 1 copy of Masterpiece and 2 Dynamite Knight. For the frogs, we run similar to what used to be the standard lineup when Paleozoics were very popular. We run 3 copies of Swap Frog, we run 2 copies of Duke Frog, and we run 2 copies of Ronin Totem. Only 2 copies of Duke Frog and 2 copies of Ronin Totem because we don't want to have too many monsters in our hand, especially with card demise, and we want to be using our normal summon on the True Draco cards. So, only a total of 7 frogs. For our last monster, we also run a copy of Maxi. For the spells, we run 3 copies of Draconic Diagram. Now, we don't run Terraforming because we don't want to clog too many copies of it, and it could also be awkward drawing multiples. However, resolving 1 usually means winning the game, and so we do run 3 copies. For the rest of the spells, we run a standard 3 Desires and 3 copies of Card of Demise. Now, both of these cards help us draw our traps, and drawing True Draco cards isn't that bad either. One thing I will say, going back to Draconic Diagram, is that it has a similar thing as to what the Fiend Griefing Backjack combo used to do, is put traps in the graveyard before you have to activate one. So you can destroy a Paleozoic in your hand, and you can bring it back later with a Paleozoic that you activate on the field. So, Draconic Diagram, Pod Desires, and Card Demise are 9 really good spell cards to run in the deck. And then we do run 1 additional spell card. We run 1 copy of True Draco Heritage. Now, True Draco Heritage doesn't really have the same function ability in this deck as it does in the normal True Draco deck. However, it still acts as a pretty decent upstart goblin in the deck, and it's searchable, and it also is like a brilliant fusion of sorts because when you have Dynamite Knight in your hand or Masterpiece, you can get an additional normal summon, which doesn't come up too much, but it does come up. So, although you don't really send too many card types in one turn, you almost never send monsters, and you actually can never send spells because you only play 1 heritage. So when you do tribute a trap or on occasion a monster, you can draw 1 to 2 cards with heritage. So it is pretty decent, and it's also really good in the True Draco match because you can draw off of their cards, and not just yours. So 1 copy of True Draco Heritage. So those are our 10 spells. And there were also 11 monsters, by the way, and the rest of them are traps. 3 copies of Paleozoic Olenoides, 3 copies of Paleozoic Deinamiscus, 3 copies of Paleozoic Canadia, 1 copy of Lancholia, and 1 copy of Morella. Now I figured that this was the best lineup possible. I'm not a huge fan of Morella, as you can really send Paleozoics to your grave before you have to activate your traps with Diagram. However, Morella can still have some function in the deck, as it is searchable off of Opabenaya. And Lancholia, of course, acts as the Omega of the deck. Other than that, looking at the main 9, probably the weakest one would be Deinamiscus. However, it's still really good dealing with face-up cards, and there's a lot of face-up cards that in the meta have to be dealt with, such as, of course, Diagram, Barrage, many others. And Canadia is very good because it can stop Zoo's Trident and deal with other possible threats. Now it does lose a little bit of power because with the new Link monsters coming out, they can't go into face-down defense position because they don't have any defense points. So it cannot be used on a Link monster. However, you can still deal with a lot of other threats, especially Trident and an opponent's Dynamite Knight. So with that being said, we move on to the rest of the traps. We run 2 copies of True King's Return and 1 copies of True Draco Apocalypse. I sort of stole this ratio from Patrick Hoban in Nats. He ran 2 copies of Return and 1 copy of Apocalypse, and I quite liked that ratio as I tested it out myself. And so I figured playing triple Desires, similar to Hoban did, you often banish one of them, and Return being the better one of the 2, you would like to run 2 of this and 1 of this. So you run a total of 3. So 3 of those, and then for the rest we run 3 copies of Reckless Greed for draw power, 3 copies of Magic Deflector, sort of a Dimensional Barrier. I think it kind of replaces Dimensional Barrier in the main deck because of how power crept the Zodiac deck has become in this 2-week period of not having Mrs. Radiant, but yet playing by the Link rules. And so I think that Magic Deflector is definitely more important than Dimensional Barrier because Card of Demise True Dracos is the best deck. So 3 copies of Deflector, and even if you do play Zodiac, it still hurts Barrage. So 3 Deflectors, and then we run 1 copy of Breakthrough Skill to send off Morella, and 1 copy of Imperial Order, the Vanity's Emptiness of sorts in the format. So those are our traps. For the side deck, we have 2 copies of Barrier Statue of the Torrent, very good against dinosaurs, going first. 2 copies of Lava Golem, very good now in Links, that they spend a lot of resources making a Link monster and an extra deck monster. Many times a Trident and a Hammer Kong, should be them off. Although you do lose your normal summon, you still deal with the threat, and they have a very hard time recovering from that. For the traps in the side deck, we run 2 copies of Unending Nightmare, very good against Pendulums, 2 copies of Dimensional Barrier against Zoo, 2 copies of Solemn Strike, many decks lose out to this card, 2 copies of Summon Limit, mostly for dinosaurs and Zodiacs, 2 copies of Anti-Spell for the True Draco match, and 1 copy of Lost Wind, just as a filler of sorts, very good in many matchups. So that is it for the side deck, and finally for the extra deck, really only relevant part is 3 Totally Awesome, 2 copies of Opabenaya, 2 copies of Animal Acaris, and the rest are really just fillers. Cat Shark, Centauria, Javelin. Honestly, Armor Kappa and Pure Light should just be 2 zoos, probably Trident and Boarbow. Utopic Future, number 45, and Downward. Most of these, probably the Armor Kappa and the Pure Light, will become a Link Spider and a Decode Talker post Links. So, that is it for the deck profile. I fancy this deck to be pretty good post Links, and even after the Code of Duelist releases, I think that Paleozoics will once again become a pretty viable deck for the 2017 meta. So, for now, this is Henry, signing off from NCG.